The annual Paviors Lecture is organised here in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Imperial College, London, and organised by the Worshipful Company of Paviors of the City of London in conjunction with the department and with the Institution of Civil Engineers. This year's lecture is the 42nd in the series, and the objective each year is to invite a leading speaker to talk on a subject broadly within the field of transport infrastructure, with a view to enthusing undergraduate students and providing subject matter of interest both to members of the livery company and their guests. This year's lecture is given by Dana Skelley, Asset Manager, Transport for London, and will be on the subject of London streets, safe, reliable and cared for. I very much hope you enjoy the lecture.
So I'm really privileged to be here actually, to offer a lecture on the road, a case study for London. I just wanted to start by reflecting on the street, the road, the thoroughfare. It's absolutely everywhere in our culture. It's more than a place to be or a means of getting from A to B. It's in literature, the road to Wigan Pier. It's in history, all roads lead to Rome. It's in music, Penny Lane is in... Sorry. The important point is that the street, the road, the lane is an important aspect of our cultural consciousness. It's more than just a product or an asset. And because of this, I suggest that while the street is not the most neglected aspect of our built environment, it is essential that we maintain safe, reliable and cared for streets designed for all of our futures. Accordingly, I'm going to share my vision of our streets, where they've come from, what this means now, and what we can do to promote and deliver safe, reliable and cared for streets in the future. So streets and roads are absolutely the lifeblood of London. They're used every day, at every single time of day. They're referenced in art, literature, cinema, history. Of course, the primary purposes are to get to and from work, school, to shop, to do business, to visit, to enjoy all that the city has to offer. There are also those veins and arteries through which goods and services flow to keep the city functioning. Reflecting on London though, working well, streets and roads keep London thriving. But when they're clogged up and overcrowded, the city's culture, health, economy and environment all suffer. So I want to start by looking back at what we've inherited in London to provide some context for the challenges that we meet every single day in the capital and of course elsewhere. So the London street network is a result of over 2,000 years of continuous habitation, which means that London's roads are sometimes organic and other times far more organised. Still traceable today are some of the great paved highways of Roman Britain, the A1 for example, built for moving troops and supplies across the province. Now that medieval expansion of the City of London as a major trading and commercial centre resulted in a densely built network of narrow alleys, passages and lanes crammed with shops, houses and markets. We can picture it almost. Of course, this medieval pattern gave rise to the Worshipful Company of Paviors and their responsibilities for the state of the carriageways and for hygiene. Interestingly, London's drive for commerce first was visible even in the aftermath of the Great Fire in 1666, when there were formal plans for rebuilding, which were rejected in favour of maintaining these medieval street patterns to aid the rapid reconstruction of the city. Until 1888, when local authorities were given responsibility for public roads outside of the square mile, the infrequent and often ineffective maintenance of highways by parishes meant that major roads were almost impassable most of the time. This massive increase in traffic generated by the Industrial Revolution demanded a much more reliable system. This was partly met, of course, by turnpikes that were privately run and financed by tolls that were collected from the users. But the prevalence of horse-drawn vehicles and carts created, of course, its own problems, as London's streets were piled high with manure. In many respects, these problems and solutions are the same ones we face today. Maybe not so much the manure, but perhaps replaced by NOx and CO2 pollution. Horse manure certainly was a problem, but not the only pollutant. The dry London summer of 1858, which was unaffectionately known as the Great Stink, was caused by the entire street system and sanitation neglect. The River Thames at Westminster was so smelly from human sewage pouring from the streets straight in that the atmosphere in the Houses of Parliament became absolutely intolerable. At this time, the street was actually a cause of taxation, a penny in the pound being collected for the new sewer system. And of course, it was also an inspiration. It certainly inspired Sir Joseph Bazalgette to put forward a plan for a new sewer flowing from west to east, into which all the existing sewage channels would empty, rather than into the river. He designed the embankment as we know it. This cultural attraction we experience is so much more than a thoroughfare. The design was driven by needing walls close to the low water mark and infilling the area behind. This created the space not only for the sewer, but also for a road and for the new, partially underground district line. Stretches of garden were created along the embankment using the subsoil and topsoil that was excavated to build the railway. So we think about it, Joseph's sewer network for central London was instrumental in relieving the city from cholera epidemics while beginning the cleansing of the River Thames. It was also instrumental in the development of a concept and aesthetic of a designed look and feel to street and place that perhaps hadn't been seen since the Romans and their fora or great town squares. Along with other towns and cities, the Industrial Revolution caused a massive increase in traffic and eventually, obviously, the shift from horse-drawn vehicles and carts to motor transport. Now, this step change in volume and technology demanded a much more reliable system. So we start to see traffic management at the end of the 19th century with the introduction of traffic signals. It's worth noting that this innovation actually came at a price, as the traffic signals were first gas-powered, and during the first installation, it exploded and killed a policeman. The increasing dominance of the motor car in the 20th century led to a step change in road engineering and urban planning, whereby we started to have strategic planning developing. First of all, there was a notable plan after the First World War, and later Abercrombie's ambitious citywide reconstruction plans after the Second World War. However, this approach reached its zenith and decline with the proposed ringways around the capital planned in the late 1960s, but abandoned due to local opposition, spiralling costs, and the new phenomenon of blight. And note, the response to the technology of the motor car came after the fact. It's always difficult, if not impossible, to predict how technology will eventually roll out in terms of the preferred usage. We could possibly think of Uber as a consequence of the military GPS technology that was developed in the 90s, for example. Following the 1963 Buchanan Report, Traffic in Towns, and the work of designers, thinkers, there's been a radical shift in attitudes to roads and placemaking across the capital. Today, we're so much more conscious of the need to balance the roles of roads as placements of movement and places of social interaction. Again, we must defer to the needs of people and their usage of these spaces and their cultural importance too. Streets are really essential components of the urban fabric. They're places in themselves. They're the most immediate and interactive part of the urban realm, and we encounter them every single day. So I want to start looking at the present and what streets are for, what we do today. Words such as road, which is from the Anglo-Saxon ride, suggest movement from one place to the other. The word street, from Latin stanere, meaning to pave, suggests an area for public use, but not exclusively devoted to circulation. The street, of course, by definition, is a multifunctional place, providing enclosure and activity as well as movement. So let's just recap on its main functions. Circulation for both vehicles and pedestrians, bicycles, access to buildings and the provision of light and ventilation to buildings, a route for utilities, storage space, especially for vehicles, and that public space for human interaction and sociability. Everything from parades to protests to chance encounters. In other words, cultural use, the stuff about people. Virtually all streets in urban areas perform all of these functions, and often the balance between them will vary along one length of road. Ideally, all these facets of the street can successfully coexist, but all too often it's one function, usually the movement of vehicles, that has been allowed to dominate. Highway authorities were set up to deliver street management. However, the systems to ensure this happens in London are complex and sometimes mean that achieving these ends can be challenging and even contradictory. So in London, the responsibility for maintaining streets is shared between Highways England, managing the orbital and tails of the motorways, Transport for London, managing the Transport for London road network, which is the red routes in London, and all the traffic signals in London, and then of course 33 London boroughs, including the City of London, managing everything else. Oftentimes, the highway authority that deals with maintenance and infrastructure can be different from the traffic authority, which deals with the traffic management issues on any given road. Some aspects of traffic management can be managed by more than a single authority. And there's also the congestion zone managed by TfL and street cleansing, which falls under the boroughs. It takes considerable collaboration for the boroughs to be able to clean the high-speed road network with the red routes on, for example. And it's a very complicated and often invisible series of relationships that need to be maintained just to meet the status quo. And what about utilities? One of the main functions of the street, of course, is a conduit for utilities, drainage, water, gas, telecommunications. Just to reflect on this, statutory undertakers have acquired the right to lay their services in the adopted highway and to dig up the street without the need for much planning, really. This privilege also extends to above-ground installations such as telephone lines and pillar boxes. So with the deregulation of the telecommunications in 1987 and the proliferation of cable and IT companies, this places extreme demands on many, many urban streets. The street has kind of become a workhorse on which the servicing of towns and cities relies, and ultimately the conduit for private utilities to operate profitable businesses. These complex relationships sometimes mean compromise. A small example of this is the telephone box. These assets, as many of us will remember, were once critical to our ability to communicate. But now almost everyone has a mobile phone, so telephone boxes are often redundant. They're a vestigial structure of the road network, and apart from the heritage value placed on the old T-series telephone boxes, are more commonly seen as decrepit and neglected, filled with prostitutes' cards and the stench of urine. But due to legislative rights, getting telecommunications owners to agree to remove a telephone box is nigh on impossible, and so many remain a blight on the streetscape. In order to improve reliability on a day-to-day basis, We try to simplify the way that we manage London's roads, and all interested parties must cooperate and collaborate. Firstly, to minimise disruption from planned works, it's essential for all stakeholders to seek and share early work plans to coordinate and prioritise all works activities. Once plans are agreed, then the work is permitted and organisations can get prosecuted for non-compliance of permit conditions. There's a lane rental scheme which applies to the most traffic-sensitive locations at the most traffic-sensitive times of day, and that covers just over half of the red routes in London, and it's in place to incentivise behaviour change of those that need to work on the street and minimise highway occupation by applying a daily charge. And secondly, for unplanned disruption, the road network in London is continuously monitored to ensure rapid response to incidents and to congestion. State-of-the-art traffic control systems and well-trained people are deployed in real time to manage congestion. We use digital screens to alert drivers to disruption, as well as giving advance warning of future disruptions due to roadworks or large events, whilst also generating income from advertising on these screens. So let's now explore some examples of what makes streets and roads unreliable. Why do they come unreliable in the first place? A road is an openly accessible network that operates 24/7. Big difference from the underground in terms of it being a closed system. Bear that in mind. Because as you'll easily be able to imagine, there are almost any number of interventions which can cause delay on our roads. In terms of unreliability, there are two issues: the finite road space and resilience when key strategic routes or arteries get blocked. Let's look at some notable illustrative examples. The Blackwall Tunnel. Many of you will recognise this. And in May last year, a crane's hydraulic oil spillage of more than half a mile long occurred in the Blackwall Tunnel. And it was in the morning peak. It caused major disruption for commuters with queues of up to 5 miles long. The northbound tunnel had to remain closed for the rest of the day while the liquid was identified, cleansed, and then the road had to be resurfaced, the hydraulic oil being corrosive to road materials. Even so, this rapid response and engineering to address the technical issues, including opening an asphalt plant overnight, did little to appease the bus passengers and drivers delayed by many hours. And there's another part of this relationship here which is rarely articulated, which is that the consumers of the road also have a duty to the road and to its other users. Such a spillage is clearly avoidable, as it's a maintenance issue on behalf of the crane operator. The fact is, roads are not free, even if they are not tolled. We do need to think about changing the culture to be more vigilant and more rigorous, perhaps, in prosecution. The pain of the consumer in this case was caused by neglect of privately owned plant rather than any neglect by the road operator. There are also occasions where disruptions can occur for months due to collisions. On September 2005, a barge became wedged under one of the arches of Battersea Bridge during the night's high tide. The bridge was damaged by the impact of the 2,000-tonne gravel barge, and the bridge was closed to cars for 4 months whilst repairs were undertaken. Me that attended the site as the call-out engineer when this occurred. I live fairly locally, and also I got on my bicycle, which seemed a sensible thing to do given the congestion that was occurring at the time. I arrived at the bridge, which was cordoned off, quite rightly, and a policeman standing there stopping anybody from going over the bridge. And I announced that I was there. Could I come through, bring my bicycle through, as I was here to see what we might do to fix this bridge, what we might need to do. But he looked at me with this cordon in his hand saying, "But you're a woman." I said, "Yes, I'm one of those too." Anyway, after much transferring of cards, demonstrating that I was indeed who I says I was allowed onto the bridge. But actually, with the damage underneath the structure, there's not really much use being on top of the bridge. So I needed to get to see underneath the bridge. So arranged with colleagues from the Port of London Authority for a launch to pick me up, for me to be able to have a look underneath the bridge. Now, it's late in the evening. I had to get myself off to a pier to be picked up by the Port of London Authority and taken late on my own on a pier in the dark on the river. And while I'm waiting for the Port of London Authority launch, a police boat comes through the river and I hear, "Don't do it, love! It can't be that bad." Anyway, it's pretty clear to me that few of these reactions would have occurred had I been a male. And this is an important consideration. The culture and demographics that work on maintaining and managing the street does not reflect the users. Users are from different communities, varied mobility, different gender and sexuality. This too needs a culture change, a big culture change for our industry to reflect the diversity of those it serves. A more recent example of unplanned disruption occurred only last month, when Victoria Embankment was closed after an unexploded World War II bomb was found in the River Thames. The operation by the Royal Navy and Metropolitan Police forced Waterloo Bridge, Westminster Bridge and Victoria Embankment to close. Police were called to the river at about 5:15 and they reopened the riverfront at about 3 o'clock in the morning. But as if all this wasn't enough, all of this excitement happened to be on the same night that Woody Harrelson was directing his groundbreaking live cinema project, Lost in London. In a cinematic first, the film was shot in a 100-minute single take and broadcast live to 550 US cinemas and one in the UK. Waterloo Bridge, where the closing scene of the film took place, was reopened just in time for the live shoot to go ahead as planned. Did I mention the cultural aspects of the street? So moving on now to think about the reliability impacts of planned approaches. Sometimes the congestion levels that we see are within our control, and other times they are the result of social and economic factors, even at a global level, that have been beyond the ability to plan for. For instance, over the last 4 years, there's been a spike in delivery vehicles in central London as more and more people are shopping online and having items sent to their workplaces. London's problem with online delivery vans isn't just that there are too many of them, it's where they are, delivering to people's workplaces in the city during the day rather than to their homes in the evening. The advent of Uber has revolutionised the private hire industry, but it has also meant that there are a lot more cars on the road, particularly in central London. Neither of these innovations were predicted by planners, and there are sure to be other technological and social revolutions which we won't be able to predict. However, there are factors that affect reliability that we can and do plan for. For example, achieving a network of segregated cycle superhighways has meant that there's been a significant short-term disruption while these schemes get built. But we also know that this new infrastructure will affect road capacity in the long term, as space which was previously allocated to vehicles has been reallocated to cyclists. The nature of our streets are changing before our very eyes in London to adapt to changing behaviours and consumption and culture, the culture of the bicycle in this case. As London's economy and population grow apace, we need thousands of more homes, together with places to work, shops, and indeed public spaces. All of this affects and will affect the way that our roads operate. At the same time, we all have growing expectations for the quality of the streets where we live and work. They have to be great places as well as enabling people, goods and services to get around London safely and reliably. And why, you may ask, is any of this actually important? Well, streets and roads make up 80% of London's public space, the cultural bit. Also, more than 80% of all journeys in London today are made entirely by road, and over 90% of all freight is transported this way. This creates a continual challenge for an urban road network that was originally designed for horse and cart. Our streets and roads, and the way we manage them, have to respond to these changes to keep them fit for a world city. Some measures to improve London's streets and roads have already been delivered, but strategic policies, not least those to help create more space and establish different ways of funding, are equally important to keep London moving. But living in the now means we also have to live in the past. We have a London infrastructure legacy of many gyratories, passé junction designs. We have a legacy of roundabouts and one-way systems. However, our attitude and relationship with cars, at least in London, has changed dramatically in the intervening years, and our focus is now on creating healthy streets where people can walk, socialise, feel comfortable, safe. This shift in focus and the recent emphasis on the cultural aspect of the street has meant that we are actively creating public spaces, many of them part funded by developers and through commercial support, but they're for people to enjoy while still allowing road users to move through efficiently and safely. Spaces and streets outside major transport hubs, such as King's Cross, are being transformed to create public spaces that act as seamlessly as public squares as they do major transportation interchange. Major improvements to the road network, such as those at Elephant and Castle in central London, are now recognised for their benefits as catalysts for wider regeneration, for inward investment and local economic growth, by providing better connectivity, by providing safer and more attractive spaces, and generally a much better environment. But how do we position ourselves now and in the future? There's a growing realisation that we need to change the way we think about our streets. While 20th century policies focused on the speed of the vehicular movement, today we're placing more significance on health and well-being, on safety, on walking, on cycling and public transport, while still permitting the wheels of commerce to function efficiently. Meeting the challenges of a growing London demands imaginative thinking, different approaches to planning. New policies are being developed to deal with London's expanding road use over the coming years. Underlying these is a clear recognition that London must balance both movement and place if it is to remain successful. It is this combination of movement and place that defines the culture of the blighted streets of the 70s and 80s, which were earmarked to be widened into trunk roads, and today the pedestrianisation of Trafalgar Square, which has completely changed the cultural feel of this iconic London landmark. So, to encourage this thinking, a matrix of 9 street types for London has been developed to help inform decisions on road management and investment at a strategic and local level. Central to this is the idea that streets and roads play a variety of roles, which can change even from morning to evening or from weekday to weekend, and that the relative balance between movement and place should inform their design and their management. So a core road, for example, will have a strategic importance for movement, and while these places are also of high importance for local residents, they're not themselves a draw to people throughout London. However, city places, such as Covent Garden, do not serve at a London-wide strategic movement function, but they're draws for people from all over the world for cultural purposes. So this approach and categorisation helps us to understand how our roads are actually functioning and performing, allowing us to compare that information to our expectations. This approach will help us redraw our highway management boundaries, help us to manage our expectations of performance, or help us decide where to invest in the road network. So safe, reliable and cared for streets creates different meanings for different road users. The move towards a more shared use of the street and the removal of barriers to pedestrian movement has, for TfL, resulted in an interesting conundrum. Let me share with you our recent experience of the removal of pedestrian guardrailing from London's roads. At TfL, in the last few years, we have decluttered our streets and have a design premise not to include guardrail unless there's a strong safety case to do so. Whilst urban planners agreed the streetscape can be dramatically enhanced through decluttering unnecessary street furniture, public and political perception was that pedestrian guardrails provide protection to pedestrians from vehicles when they run off the road. We're often met with resistance when we propose to remove pedestrian guardrail, as the public tends to think that removing guardrail will increase pedestrian vulnerability to vehicles. We recently undertook a study to understand the effects of removing guardrails where we have controlled staggered crossings. And the results show that at staggered crossings, where the pedestrian guardrail was removed, the number of pedestrian and vehicle collisions were reduced by around 50%, over a 3-year period, that is. And we think there are a number of reasons for this. There's greater visibility of pedestrians to drivers, especially small children. Drivers are actually starting to reduce speeds to be more cautious where pedestrians are not physically separated from the carriageway. There's a reduction in risky pedestrian behaviour walking around the pedestrian guard railing or into the carriageway. The removal of pedestrian guardrails changes how a street functions and it improves the aesthetic quality. If we look at examples here, this is Piccadilly before the removal of guardrail, and this is after the removal of guardrail. You can see it's got a much more open feel, increased visibility for both pedestrians and motorists, and has the benefit of allowing pedestrians to cross informally at any point along the street. However, one unavoidable consequence of the guardrail removal programme has been the removal of a guidance facility that is used by visually impaired people at staggered crossings. They use guardrail on these crossings to navigate to the next crossing point. By working with this group, this user group, staggered crossings have actually been redesigned, the ones without pedestrian guardrail, with an internal island space which is at the same level as the carriageway and bound by curbs with a 5-inch upstand. Over the last few years, we've implemented several of these designs. However, we have reports of some pedestrians who claim to have tripped and fallen into the carriageway or cycle track from these new design of crossings and have suggested their removal to avoid future incidents. So with this approach, we do aim to change the culture of the street. However, as you've heard, it remains difficult for us as engineers to balance change to achieve safety, reliability and the cared for elements of my vision for the street. The future is, as they say, another country. And certainly, that future for London's streets and roads is not yet fully mapped out. New technologies and data sharing are already defining a smart and sustainable future of transport. But can we use new thinking to change roads in a way that fairly reflects what we need of them? I'm going to look at 3 examples briefly: the automated vehicle, the constraint of available road space, and healthy streets. So autonomous vehicles are already being trialled and they can obviously offer many benefits: reduced number of road deaths and injuries, optimised use of road space to reduce congestion, and extended access to mobility. These vehicles reflect this modern culture of digital systems and point of consumption delivery. But there could be downsides, including assessing liability in the case of an accident, increasing the attractiveness of car travel, issues in integrating road infrastructure and potential systems hacking, and managing the way they actually interact with other road users. How can we make sure that these new technologies are taken up in a way that provides the maximum benefit for London and are part of the overall solution for how people live, work and travel around the city in the future? In the current discussion of urban transit and congestion, autonomous vehicles inevitably show us as the future fix-all. There's a vigorous debate raging about whether AVs will relieve or exacerbate current traffic trends. There should be at least one clear benefit. High-speed highways filled exclusively with driverless cars should at least be less prone to human error caused jams. If all the cars that end up in these jams were self-driving, they would be constantly reacting appropriately. The net result of that is that they could all be moving forward at a collectively uniform speed, and therefore the throughput of existing roads would go up. Self-driving also holds promise for fixed-route vehicles, of course, such as buses and vans, major sources of London congestion. But when will the first vehicles to go fully autonomous happen? That remains an open question. Despite headline-grabbing stunts like Uber's autonomous beer delivery and Tesla's claim that all its new vehicles are fully rigged for self-driving, by estimations, AV technology won't be fully mature for another 10 years, could be around 40 years until they truly own the roads. In the long interim, autonomous vehicles will need to navigate among and around us, imperfect humans, so their ability to dramatically reduce congestion will be limited. What we do know is that simply managing our existing road space will not be enough to meet the different needs of our growing city, and we still need to investigate ways of replacing or creating new space over the coming decades. New routes act as catalysts for the creation of new neighbourhoods by connecting those communities, supporting new development, encouraging active travel and reducing journey times. This will especially be the case in East London, which is set to see some of the capital's most significant expansion in coming years. 1/3 of London's overall population growth is expected in this part of London, and many areas that were once industrial are now available for building new homes. New and proposed river crossings could provide improved links for pedestrians, cyclists, public transport and road users by a combination of bridges, tunnels and passenger services. User charging and funding contributions from new development could form part of the package to deliver these new crossings and help manage demand. But coming back to the immediate future and considering the next 4 years, then it's healthy streets that will be a focus for all of us in London, Transport for London. These healthy streets aim to reduce traffic pollution and noise and create a more attractive, accessible and people-friendly environment where everybody can enjoy spending time and being physically active, and ultimately to improve people's health. In central London, there is likely to be a shift in emphasis to prioritise pedestrians and cyclists, as streets such as Oxford Street are redesigned as places for people, not traffic. So the Healthy Streets approach will measure the 10 indicators that are shown on this wheel here. The aim of this work is to promote walking and cycling as a way of improving public health and championing active travel to release pressure on our road network. This will be a holistic and evidence-based approach to delivering a better public realm. That's the new culture of health and well-being reflected in the streets. We're supporting the development of the street types and the Healthy Streets approach with on-street trials of concepts such as flexible road lanes adapting to different uses throughout the day and repurposing parking bays to provide seating and small green spaces. It won't be very long before you see these. So, in conclusion, we owe it to present and future generations to create well-designed places that will serve the needs of the local community, culturally, commercially, and with care. Experience suggests that many of the street patterns, designs and usage facilities built today will last for maybe hundreds of years. So let's continue to work together to improve the quality of life for people. Streets will always be the arteries and cultural canvas of our communities. Coexistence of supply and demand on the street necessitates an integrated and strategic approach from all stakeholders. So I call for greater integration, better future requirement sharing and a reduction in sort of provision silos. I call for this so we may maximise availability and serviceability of our streets. I call for us to do this together to preserve and enhance the culture of the street and its communities now and in the future. Streets need to be safe for all the people who use them, for all the reasons they do, whether economic or cultural. We need to use every possible method to ensure maximum reliability. Care? People care about their streets, and so does our industry. And I believe it's the longevity of the worshipful company of Paviors that's testament to this. Thank you.